Hello, I'm Ed Needham, editor of the fabulous literary magazine Strong Words, and this is my podcast, The 5 Rules of Writing. In each episode, I speak to a most excellent writer in a particular genre about how they do it. And if you'd like to know more about Strong Words, and specifically how to subscribe, go to www.strong-words.co.uk and you'll be whisked straight to the website. Hello and welcome to the 5 Rules of Writing, brought to you by Strong Words magazine. Now, this is a podcast where I talk to writers about the 5 things they know to be true in writing, whatever it is that they write for a living. So whether they spend their days penning limericks for children or translating Tolstoy, there are some aspects of their work that are absolutely non-negotiable. Now, sharing his 5 rules today is a master of ancient and pre-modern history. Among his works are histories of the Roman Republic, the imperial house of Caesar, ancient Persia, and histories of Christianity and Islam. But along the way, he has also reinvented, or at least reinvigorated, the history book by taking something that was traditionally thought of as a bit of a slog at best and turning it into something gripping, vivid, and perhaps the first time in the history of the history book, something people looked forward to reading. So I'd like to welcome ancient history's reigning king of the castle, Tom Holland. Tom, welcome.
Thank you very much. I think you are exaggerating. I think there'll be plenty of historians that people look forward to reading.
Well, I look forward to...
Very kind of you, very kind of me.
I look forward to hearing their angry knock on the door. But Tom, you've completely sort of identified and come to dominate your niche as a writer, and as a scholar of ancient history. But you started off writing in an entirely different genre, right? Vampires.
Well, even before the vampires, I wanted to be a great novelist. This was so my first love was history, and then I kind of got the literature bug in my teens and decided basically that I wanted to be Proust, which is obviously a kind of lunatic ambition to have, but that's what I decided I wanted to do. And I basically started writing vampire novels to try and make money while I wrote the great novel. And the great novel was never completed. And I ended up with a contract to write 4 vampire novels. So that's what I did. And the vampire novels were all set in specific periods of history. So the first one was Lord Byron as a vampire. And he literally was a vampire. So I had to do lots of research into his life and poetry to back this thesis up. Then I did one set in late Victorian London, one set in the Commonwealth and early Restoration period in the 17th century. Then I did one on Tutankhamun. Tutankhamun was a vampire. So vampires were popping up all over the course of history. And Tutankhamun's probable father, Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh, and it all tied in with the Fatimid Caliph Al-Hakim, who was the Muslim Caligula, as he's known, and Howard Carter, and... discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb. So I put a lot of research, particularly into that one, and because it was a vampire novel, nobody kind of paid any attention to the research at all. But I just realised doing that actually the real history was much more exciting than the vampires. I mean, the story of Akhenaten and Tutankhamun didn't need vampires to spice it up at all, and so that's why I decided, in a kind of very roundabout way, I decided that I would write narrative history. I would write real history. Okay. And did that also sort of make you think that perhaps ancient history held greater promise of providing an income? It wasn't so much. Well, so the first book I wrote was on the fall of the Roman Republic, which in my opinion is the single most thrilling narrative basically in the whole field of history. And the only conceivable rival would be the Persian invasion of Greece in the 5th century, which was actually the second history book that I then wrote. So I wrote them because I was fascinated by the subjects and I thought they were amazing topics. And when I wrote them, this kind of ancient history wasn't being written. So it was kind of like an open goal. I couldn't believe that no one had written this kind of history about the fall of the Republic because it's such a great story. So that was really why I wanted to do it. But also I wanted to do it just because, those were the periods of history that I loved best and always had done since childhood. And the odd thing is that people often say you should write about what you know and what you love. And in fiction, that's entirely understood. So it's never a surprise that people write novels about that are deeply rooted in their childhood, in their upbringing, in their kind of formative experiences. But I think often the same is true for nonfiction as well. And it was certainly the case for me that part of what I wanted to write about and wanted to convey was a sense of the excitement that I had felt in reading and being obsessed by these topics when I was a child.
And did you come at it with a plan to make history a bit less dreary and a more exciting read? As I say, I wanted to convey what it was about these periods that had thrilled me as a child and be true to that sense of excitement while also being true to the thrill of academic research, because academic research is thrilling as well. And the fact that we know anything about these distant periods is amazing. And the opportunity to convey to readers who may not particularly know about the period both the excitement of the narrative, but also the excitement that surrounds the academic study of it was absolutely what I wanted to do. So it's not a kind of either or. It's not a populist, let's get rid of anything boring kind of against a kind of dry, dusty, scholarly, let's sit in a library. Both, in my opinion, are travesties of what can be offered, because I think that scholarship at its best is at least as exciting as the raw material of Caesar's commentaries or Herodotus's account of the Persian invasion. Scholarship is thrilling, and that was absolutely part of what I wanted to do, was to convey a sense of the thrill of the scholarship as well as of the narrative. From Strong Words magazine, these are the 5 rules of writing. Let's have a look at your 5 rules. I think for anybody who's thinking of embarking on a formidable history project or a history project of any sort, I think this is particularly good advice. So let's get cracking with these. Now, your first rule, you say, save things up that you are looking forward to researching. Delayed gratification will keep your interest fresh over the entire course of writing your book. How does this work for you?
So when you come to research, say, a period of history, you'll probably come to it, as at least I do, with a kind of a pretty informed knowledge, because otherwise you wouldn't want to be writing about it. You write about what you're interested in. But of course, there's a sense in which actually researching and writing about something sharpens your knowledge very, very intensely. And so you will find that you have to do an enormous amount of preparatory work just to lay the foundations. And the risk with that is that you do so much work on it that it becomes boring. You get bored of it. You become too familiar with it. And the sense of shock and excitement starts to wane. And if you're feeling bored of it, then it's going to be harder for you to convince your readers that it's not boring. So what I always try and do is that even as I absolutely immerse myself in research material, I have a sense of what can be kind of left until I'm absolutely ready to write, so that I can then spend 2 or 3 days immersed in a particular field, or maybe even a particular aspect of scholarship, immerse myself in it, and then whoosh, I'm ready to hit the ground running.
So what's your idea of something that you look forward to researching?
Well, so I'm just at the moment, I've just begun work on a third volume in the history of Rome that I'm doing. So the first one was the fall of the Roman Republic. The second one was the first dynasty of the Caesars, ending with Nero. And I am the opening chapter is focused around a relationship that Nero had after his beloved wife Poppaea Sabina had died, possibly kicked to death by Nero. I mean, that was the rumor. And he then did what anybody in his situation would do, which was to look around for someone who looked exactly like Poppaea, find that it was a boy, castrate the boy, and then dress him up as his dead wife and treat him as his wife. Now, there's all kinds of interest. I know that is a great way into all kinds of things, but there are particular aspects of the history of eunuchs and things like that I know are going to be great and are going to be fascinating. So I'm saving them up. So I'm going to read them before as the last thing that I research before I start writing the passage. So it's saving particular things up that are going to be great, and not being greedy and not kind of rushing and doing all the research beforehand.
Okay. And how long does it take you to write a history book?
Well, how long is a piece of string? I guess the average length of a book for me is about 150,000 words. And if it's a kind of a lengthy topic, then it could take anything up to 4 years. So I've just done a history of Christianity, which is an insanely ambitious project that essentially required me to research 2,500 years of history. So that took me 4 to 5 years. But having said that, I was drawing on a lot of stuff that I'd already researched and knew about. Wow. I guess the current book I'm doing will take me a couple of years. So anything between 2 to 4 years.
Wow. So you're going to need a lot of eunuchs and boys dressed as dead wives to sustain you through that kind of a 5-year cycle.
Well, Nero and his eunuch bride die fairly quickly, so, so we move on from them.
Okay, so getting through the hard grind kind of brings us to rule 2. You say, like an iceberg, except that most of the research you do will be underwater. Presumably, you mean there's just an enormous amount of background you have to get through.
Yeah, the risk is that if you research something, that you put it in. And you get this in both academic works and historical novels, that you can tell that people have done so much research that they can't bear to let any of it go to waste. So in it all goes. But actually, I've always felt that the best evocations of history are those that kind of hint at buried depths. And that's what I have always tried to do, is to suggest, is always to leave stuff out. Because in a way that's then hinting at the kind of depth that, these societies would have had. It's impossible to convey the totality of a society. Whenever you write about something, you're always leaving things unsaid and unacknowledged. So I think that the deepest foundations are those that you don't see.
Okay, so I also think that you tend to write about subjects that people feel actually a bit guilty about, that they don't, they feel guilty about not knowing more. For example, I never learned about Julius Caesar at school, or the Bible, or in fact, or any Roman emperors. And your books very kind of successfully filled these sort of blocks of information that I really felt I ought to know more about. Is that how you approach them? Do you think, I wonder what people feel they ought to know more about.
What I absolutely, the difficulty with writing, I think particularly about religion, although I think it's also true of classical history, is that there are lots of people who don't really know it and who do feel that they should, and who might feel that they're being kind of looked down on if I, as the writer, am taking knowledge for granted. Because, why should they know stuff if they haven't studied at school or anything? I mean, it's not a given. And so I try never to take anything for granted. And in doing that, actually, you are then being kind of true to a sense of the excitement of the source material. Because if you're writing about, say, Julius Caesar with the sense that nobody knows anything about it, then nobody knows what's going to happen. Then in a sense, you're occupying the terrain of Caesar's contemporaries. Mm-hmm. They didn't know the Rubicon was going to be crossed. They didn't know that Caesar was going to defeat Pompey. They didn't know that he was going to end up dictator and murdered by his fellow senators. So if you write on the assumption that nobody knows that, then I think that firstly you're making it fresh, And secondly, you're recognizing that events as they happened were always contingent. There was never any certainty that they were going to happen. Mm-hmm. And even though we know that the lines of history, the narratives of history have already been written, people living in them didn't know that.
Okay, and you mentioned, with earlier on that you felt it was a bit of an open goal that these things hadn't been written about. But these are big subjects. How do you go about finding something new?
Well, I think one of the reasons why I'm drawn to ancient and early medieval history, and to perhaps to mythical and religious narratives as well, is that these are already shaped as literary source material. So the biblical narratives are the most formative narratives on how stories have been constructed in the West. So if you're engaging with them, if you're engaging with the story of Exodus, or if you're engaging with the parables or the story of Christ's life, these provide profound archetypes that in themselves are narratives that have shaped how we understand history and how people over the course of Western history have behaved. So that provides enormous scope if you're a writer, that you can play with this, that in a sense history is both an academic discipline and a literary form. And I guess that I try to be true to both those traditions. And if you're looking at ancient history, the source material, the prime source material, say for the Persian Wars, is the histories of Herodotus, first historian, who is a great and a very distinctively great writer, and provides huge opportunities when you're writing about the Persian Wars to pay homage to Herodotus, because in a sense you are thereby acknowledging that the source material isn't the kind of source material that you'd have if you were writing about, say, 21st century history. This is stuff that is mediated through a literary form of history. Mm-hmm. And in a sense, to deny that is not to be true to the source material. So it's kind of like I always feel when I watch films or when I read historical novels that in too great an emphasis on, say, realism, when you say medieval or ancient periods, is not true to the source material, because you can't have that realism, and because the ambition to have realism is in itself a kind of 19th century ambition. So what you will do if you do that is you'll end up writing something that is more reminiscent of Walter Scott than it might be of Tacitus or of Herodotus, say.
Okay. Now, rule 3, you say, it kind of also touches on this, perhaps. You say avoid anachronistic language. This sounds like a very personal dislike.
So obviously there are all kinds of metaphors that draw on 21st century, 20th century, 19th century images. Anything to do with gunpowder or trains or watches or anything like that is inherently anachronistic. So my rule of thumb is always only ever to, if I'm going to use metaphors, or perhaps I should even say cliches, make sure that they are compatible with the period that I'm writing about. But it goes deeper than that. And one of the reasons why I wanted to write Dominion, the book I did about the history of Christianity, which essentially argues that we are, whether we are believing Christians or not, so profoundly shaped by the inheritance of Christianity that essentially we are goldfish swimming in a bowl, and the water's a Christian. And one of the things that really brought this home to me over the process of writing about classical Greece and Rome, so the pre-Christian world, was that certain words in English were so impregnated with Christian assumptions and significations that they became impossible to use. So religion would be one. That religion carries such a Christian, and I would say specifically Protestant kind of sense, that to use it to describe what the Greeks were doing when they went up to the Acropolis, say, mm-hmm. or the Romans when they consulted the Sibylline books, was anachronistic. Even I would say, if you're describing what monks are doing in the 4th or 5th century, it's anachronistic. secular, homosexuality, all these kind of words that have a coinage that has been shaped by the history of Christianity and would have meant nothing to people in Greece and Rome. And and there are even words that have a clearly so secular does derive from a Roman word, but it doesn't have the meaning that it has for us. Or democracy, famously a Greek word. But because our understanding of democracy is shaped by Christianity, it's very, very difficult to see what the Greeks meant by democracy without doing it through Christian lenses. So you have to kind of take off your Christian tinted contact lenses to try and see what the Greeks meant by democracy. And it's something very, very different. And so that's the huge challenge and fun of it, is that that in a sense, the English language, because it's so impregnated with Christian assumptions, is a kind of enemy. And you have to, it's a slippery tool to use when you're trying to write about these very different and alien civilizations.
So that massively slims the vocabulary down that's available to you then, presumably.
Yeah, I think it broadens it out, because if you're, rather than using the word religion to describe the relationship of, say, a Roman to the gods, because there isn't a kind of a single word that sums it up, it obliges you to kind of work out in a more truthful and honest way, I think, what exactly the scope of a human being's relationship to the gods might have been, and thereby, by doing that, to explore it in a more comprehensive way than just by talking about, say, Roman religion.
And as you take such great care over this, do you find yourself sort of throwing other people's books in the swimming pool when you come across a more casual approach to vocabulary?
Sometimes I think that there are very great scholars who do use there's a wonderful book called Roman Homosexuality by a great scholar, and he says in the opening, I've called it this, but homosexuality is not a word that should be used, so I'm not going to use it anymore. I've just used this basically to get you to buy the book. So that's on. But then you do get people who I think do use words like democracy or religion in a way that is clumsy, I think. Yeah. And it does annoy me.
Okay. And your fourth rule, I think, is also kind of connected to this a little bit. You say, rule 4 is avoid the condescension of posterity. Where do you see this at its most outrageous?
I think there's a huge amount of it at the moment. I think we're living through a period of great moral ferment that I think is kind of analogous to the Protestant Reformation, to be honest, since the 60s. I think that assumptions about how people should behave, what's right and wrong, has changed at such a furious pace that trying to keep up with it can often feel like kind of running up a down escalator. And one of the markers of an age where the sense of progress is speeding up is that people rapidly, their views, their opinions, even their language can come to seem anachronistic very, very fast. And so you can end up sitting in judgment on something that somebody said, 2 years ago, that 2 years ago might have been completely inoffensive, let alone 4 decades ago, let alone two centuries ago, let alone 2,000 years ago. Mm-hmm. And I think that one of the aspects of the humanities generally, I think, is that I do not like, because it's easy and lazy, is to have a kind of framework of were these people sexist, were they racist, were they imperialist, whatever, and essentially you are measuring them against your own standard, your own moral standards. The moral standards of previous ages were very different, and that to me is part of the fascination of it, because it's about going back into a world that is different. It's the difference quite as much as the similarities that are fascinating. So if I'm writing about, again, it's kind of sharpened for me in the book about Christianity, because people's sense about what is right and wrong is changing all the time. So the sense of what someone in the Middle Ages might think is right, and the sense of what somebody in the heartlands of the Reformation thinks is right, or then again in the Enlightenment, then again in the 20th century, is very different. Be true to what they thought is what I try and do. So I try and inhabit the minds of those that I'm writing about. Not surrendering to them completely, but trying to go with the grain of what they think. And that's true as well of the dimension of the supernatural. So, that's obviously very important if you're writing about what Christians believed about angels, what Muslims believed about angels, or whatever. But I remember in Persian Fire, the book I wrote about the Persian invasions of Greece, writing about how the Persians understood the world and how the Greeks understood, how the Persians understood the dimension of the divine and how the Greeks understood the dimension of the divine. And they're so different. They're so different that essentially they sum up very profoundly the incompatibility of two radically different ways of understanding the world. So by looking at the world through the Persians and in one chapter, and then looking through the world through the eyes of the Greeks in another, it's the best way that I found to dramatize the kind of profound cultural, intellectual differences between these two ways of understanding the world.
And is there, having shed yourself of all your 21st, 20th century modern, ideas and knowledge and perspective, is there a pair of shoes you particularly enjoyed walking in from the ancient world?
I love the Greek gods, and I love the way that so the Persian understanding of the world is basically the one that we have. So one of the kind of great realizations writing about the Persians and the Greeks was that we owe at least as much to the Persians as we do to the Greeks, because the Persians saw the world as being divided into rival spheres of good and evil, light and dark, truth and lie. And that's an understanding of the world that basically we've inherited, because that profoundly influences the Jews, Christians, Muslims. That's where we are at. For the Greeks, the gods lie and are kind of terrifying. And Herodotus kind of notes it as an interesting foible of foreigners, that when they get an oracle, they just do what it says. The Greeks, Apollo is known as Loxias, the one who twists and turns. So there's a truth in what Apollo is saying, but it's never apparent, and it may well deceive you. And that's par for the course. That's what the gods do. And yet there's a kind of terrible power and charisma that the Greek gods have. And seeing the world through those eyes, seeing that, a world in which, I talked about democracy. Democracy for the Greeks is the power of the demos, and the demos is the sum of not just the living people who are born of the earth of Attica, but those who lived before, those who will come. So it's the totality of them. And if it's the men who have the vote, who sit in the assembly, who go off and fight, then that doesn't demean the fact that the role of the women, above all, is to mediate with Athena and the gods. That's just as important a role. And so the ceremonies that involve the women going up to the Acropolis to perform rituals, to commune with the gods, to keep the gods on side is just as important. And the sense of the kind of the power and the glamour and the terror of someone like Athena is very exciting. I found it, and completely true to the world. I mean, just as true to the world, it seemed to me, as the kind of the Christian understanding. Much more frightening.
Very good. So to calm us down from that terrible prospect, your fifth rule is a magnificent one. Go for long walks. Now, this is one subject that I do not need any convincing on, but how do you explain the benefits to a skeptic?
I think there's isn't there some kind of physiological thing that walking fires up the synapses or something? I find that if I am, if I'm not interested in the subject, if I find it boring, it can suddenly happen. You can read a book and just think, oh God, this is boring. And it feels like your brain is coated with dust suddenly. Or you're staring at a paragraph and the words start to swim in front of you and you forget, you forget your grammar, you forget how to spell, you can't do it. And if it's like that, there's no point in carrying on, because anything you do is going to be bad. So go out and let the wind or the fresh air remove the dust. And walking, I find, is the best way to think. So I tend not to listen to music or to podcasts if I'm walking, because I want to use the time to think and to ponder. And if you're writing about an entire ancient world, you need time and space to get to grips with it, to kind of let it marinate in your thoughts, if you like. And walking is the best way to do that. And I've always liked walking. And to be honest, over the past year, one of the advantages of the lockdown, and I'm aware that's a phrase that one shouldn't use too often, but one of the advantages of lockdown for me has been that I've had nothing else to do except go for very, very long walks. So I'm in London. I've just walked all over London, kind of in like Dickens or somebody. And I've found that has been a kind of, at no point have I felt claustrophobic or overwhelmed by the lockdown. It hasn't stopped me from writing. I've felt completely fresh when it comes to writing. And I'm sure it's because I've been doing these very, very long walks. I feel a sense of liberation, of excitement, of potential, just going out there and walking for miles across this amazing city.
Okay. Now, I always say that as a journalist, my dream scoop would be to interview Satan at home. What would your dream come true be as an ancient historian? What would you like to discover? Or
there are so many texts. There are so many texts that are missing. There's a large chunk of Tacitus, his annals, that are missing, including including the life of Caligula. Okay. And that's really what I would love to find. And then a large chunk of the histories which he wrote, which kind of ends with the build up to the siege of Jerusalem and Vespasian becoming emperor. And he's just begun to talk about the Jews in such interesting terms, and then it stops. And to find all those, would be amazing. And I think not 100% impossible.
Do you think these things might
somewhere
exist
in a kind of jar in a remote monastery, perhaps, or the dusty depths of the Vatican Library or something? Perhaps it can be done.
Quite magnificent. Tom, thank you so much for talking to me. It's been hugely enjoyable, a real privilege, and thanks again.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you.
From Strong Words magazine, these are the 5 rules of writing.